At my parents' party, my sister sneered, "Don't fill your plate, you didn't pay for this." Mom smiled. "Real family comes first." I nodded, put on my coat, and left. Moments later, the manager delivered the bill. The woman in the red dress canceled the reservation payment and asked me to hand this to you. Their faces drained of color. I had been planning my parents' anniversary dinner for 2 months before anyone else knew it existed. I found the venue myself, a private room above a steakhouse with a wall of windows facing the river, the kind of place my mother always admired from the sidewalk and never suggested we actually try. I put down the deposit in my own name and told the coordinator one thing clearly: don't mention who's paying. I wanted this to feel like a gift, not a performance. My sister found out 3 weeks in when the coordinator accidentally copied her on a menu confirmation email. She didn't ask who was hosting. She assumed, the way she always does, that whatever was happening belonged to her by default, and she started making changes. A second cake, a string quartet instead of the playlist I'd already picked, 6 guests I'd never met. Every time the coordinator called to confirm an upgrade, I said no. And every time she told the family I was being difficult about my own parents' anniversary, I let her think she'd lost those fights quietly. I've learned that explaining myself to this family rarely changes anything, and usually just gives someone new material to use against me later. This isn't new. When I was 17, I spent a month building the slideshow for my grandparents' 40th anniversary, staying up until 2 in the morning stitching together decades of scanned photographs, and my sister stood up at the party and thanked everyone for helping her put it together. Nobody corrected her. At my college graduation, she gave a toast about how she'd mentored me through school, though we'd barely spoken that year, and my mother cried like it was the truest thing she'd ever heard. When I mentioned gently that this wasn't quite how it happened, my mother told me I was being sensitive, that my sister only wanted to celebrate me in her own way, and that I should let people love me however they knew how. I stopped correcting the record a long time ago. Somewhere along the way, I started keeping it instead. It's a habit that has nothing to do with money, originally. Years ago, a landlord tried to claim I'd damaged an apartment I'd already left spotless, and I only won that dispute because I photographed every wall and receipt before I moved out of nothing but a vague, low-grade distrust of people who benefit from my silence. After that, I kept doing it. Emails, screenshots, confirmation numbers, not because I expected to need them most of the time, but because it cost me nothing to have them, and it has cost me a great deal, historically, not to. The one person in this family I've never needed to document anything with is my grandmother. She's 83, sharp in the mornings and softer by evening, and she's the only person at these gatherings who has never once compared me to my sister. She calls me by the nickname she gave me when I was 4, asks about my work like she actually wants the details, and keeps a drawer of my old birthday cards that she'll pull out unprompted, delighted, as if she's showing me something I've never seen. I visit her most Sundays, usually with coffee and the crossword, and it was on one of those visits, a few weeks before the anniversary dinner, that she mentioned, almost as an aside, that my sister had been so helpful managing her online banking lately. Her eyesight had gotten worse, she said, and the bank's website confused her, and my sister had set up something on her phone so she wouldn't have to squint at statements anymore. I remember being mildly surprised because my sister has never in her life volunteered for a task that didn't come with an audience, but I didn't think much of it beyond that. Grandma seemed pleased. I told her that was kind of my sister, and I meant it at the time. She mentioned something else that same afternoon, almost in passing, while we were doing the crossword. She said she'd noticed a withdrawal on her statement the week before that she didn't remember making. Some cash amount, not huge, and she'd asked my sister about it, and my sister had told her it was probably just the new fee the bank had started charging for paper statements. Grandma had shrugged and said, "I suppose I forget things now," in the resigned, self-deprecating way she says most things about getting older, and I'd laughed with her and changed the subject, because that's what you do when someone you love makes a joke at their own expense, even when some small, unpracticed part of you quietly notices the shape of the thing and sets it aside without knowing why. I didn't think about either comment again for weeks. I had a dinner to plan, a mother's birthday to protect from becoming once again an occasion my sister could rewrite around herself, and I told myself that was enough to manage for one season. In hindsight, I think some part of me had already started keeping the file. I just didn't know yet what it was going to be a file of. The night of the dinner, I got there early, the way I always do for things I've actually planned, and wore the red coat my mother gave me 2 Christmases ago, the one she said made me look like I was trying too hard. I hung it on the back of my chair and reviewed the final details with the coordinator one more time. Menu confirmed, flowers confirmed, my card on file for the balance after service, my name the only one on the contract, exactly as it had been from the start. My sister arrived 40 minutes late in white, which she must have known would stand out against the room's soft gold lighting, and swept in kissing our parents on both cheeks before she'd even taken off her jacket. She scanned the table for a full 10 seconds before she started moving place cards. She moved herself to the seat beside our mother. She moved me to the end, near the kitchen door, where the waitstaff kept brushing past with trays balanced on their forearms. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever does in this family until I'm the one who has to. She spent the first course collecting compliments she hadn't earned. She told our aunt she'd handled everything, gesturing vaguely at the flowers I'd approved after rejecting 3 of her upgrade requests. She told our father the string quartet was her idea, though I'd specifically declined the string quartet 3 separate times over email, in writing, and paid for the smaller trio I'd originally wanted instead. I watched her rewrite 2 months of quiet, unglamorous work into a single glowing evening she'd apparently conjured out of love for our mother. And I told myself, as I have told myself at every family occasion for the last decade, that the point was the room, the food, my parents' faces, not who got the credit for it. I have gotten very good at telling myself that. I am less good some nights at believing it all the way through. Somewhere between the second course and the third, my mother turned to my sister and said, in the warm, performative voice she reserves for public praise, "I don't know what we'd do without you, sweetheart. You always think of everything." My sister smiled and reached for our mother's hand across the table, and for a moment I watched my mother's whole face soften, in a way I hadn't seen it soften at me in longer than I wanted to count. It isn't that I need my mother to say those words to me. It's that I have never once in 28 years heard her say them without meaning them for someone else. I thought, not for the first time, about the difference between my sister and me. My sister has never planned an event in her life so much as she has arrived at the center of one already in motion and claimed the momentum as her own. I used to think this made her lucky. Lately, I think it makes her something closer to a current, the kind that doesn't generate force so much as redirect whatever's already moving, and leaves you disoriented about which way you were originally headed. Between courses, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my grandmother sent to both me and my sister, asking if either of us could stop by Tuesday to help her sort out something with the bank. Nothing urgent. My sister replied first, a single thumbs up, and then, a minute later, "Don't worry, Grandma, I've got it handled. You don't need to bother anyone else with this." I read it twice. Something about the phrasing snagged, the way a splinter snags before you've registered you've been cut, but the appetizer plates were being cleared, and my father was tapping his water glass to say something, and I put the phone face down and told myself I'd think about it Tuesday. My father's toast was short and sincere, the way his toasts always are when my sister hasn't scripted them in advance. He talked about meeting our mother 32 years ago at a diner that no longer exists, about the particular stubbornness it takes to stay married that long and still like the person you married, and for a few minutes the table felt like what I'd actually wanted it to feel like when I booked the room 2 months ago. My mother cried a little, the good kind of crying, and reached for my father's hand instead of my sister's, and I let myself believe for the length of that toast that the night might still belong to the people it was supposed to belong to. Then the main course arrived, and my sister, mid-sentence about how exhausting it had been to coordinate the seafood tower she hadn't paid for and I hadn't approved, reached across the table and put 2 fingers on my wrist just as I reached for the serving spoon. "Don't fill your plate," my sister said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, her fingers still on my wrist. "You didn't pay for this." The table went quiet the way it always does when everyone wants to see how much I'll absorb before I say something back. My mother looked up from her wine glass and smiled, the smile she uses when she wants a conflict to be over before it's had the chance to actually start. "Real family comes first," she said. I had arrived first. I had signed the contract. I was sitting at the end of the table by the kitchen door because my sister had moved my place card an hour earlier, and my mother was telling a room full of relatives that I wasn't real family for reaching toward a dish I had already paid for, in full, 2 months in advance. I thought about pulling the folded contract out of my bag and setting it on the table beside my sister's plate. I thought about listing out loud every phone call, every declined upgrade, every detail she had quietly claimed as hers over the last 2 hours. I had done exactly that before, in exactly this family, more times than I wanted to count, and I could remember the outcome of every single one of those conversations with painful precision. Nothing had ever changed. My mother had never once afterward looked at my sister differently. She had only ever looked at me like I was the one who'd made the evening difficult by insisting on the truth, so I set the spoon down instead. "You're right," I said. My sister's mouth twitched into a small, satisfied shape. She thought I was folding. "I shouldn't eat something I didn't contribute to," I said, and stood and reached for the coat on the back of my chair. My mother's smile faltered, just slightly, like she'd expected the scene to end with me sitting back down, chastened, the way it always had before. "Sit down, don't be dramatic," she said, but there was something uncertain in it now, a question mark she hadn't meant to leave there. "I'm not being dramatic," I said. "I'm correcting an arrangement." I put the coat on and walked toward the private room's glass doors. Nobody followed me. I hadn't expected them to. My father's eyes were on his wine glass. My aunt was very suddenly interested in her napkin. My sister was already turning back to the table, already recalibrating, already, I imagined, preparing the version of this story she would tell everyone once I was gone. The coordinator was at the front desk when I came out, and he looked up before I'd said a word, the way people do when they've already guessed what's coming. 3 days earlier, when my sister had spent an hour on the phone rearranging seating charts she had no authority to change, I had sat down with him during a quiet moment and asked one question, almost idly, the way you ask a question you don't expect to need answered. "If something happens at the table and I need to leave," I'd said, "what happens to the bill?" He'd walked me through it patiently. The contract had only ever had one name on it, and it wasn't going anywhere until I said so. I hadn't known 3 days ago that I would need the answer tonight. I had asked because I keep a file, and I keep a file because I have learned, slowly and expensively, that the moment you need proof is never the moment you expect to need it. "I'd like the payment authorization pulled," I told him now. "Whatever's still outstanding, don't run it." He nodded like he'd been half expecting the sentence all evening. "And if they ask who to blame, tell them the truth," I said. "Tell them the woman in the red dress canceled it and asked you to bring them the bill yourself." I don't know. Looking back, whether I said it because I wanted them to know exactly who had made this decision, or because some part of me was already tired of being the only person in this family willing to say things plainly. Maybe both. I was at the elevator when I heard the glass doors open again behind me, and I turned in time to see him carrying the black folio across the room, unhurried, and setting it down beside my sister's plate. I didn't go back in to watch. I'd already seen enough of that particular expression on her face over the years to know exactly what it would look like, and for once, I didn't need to witness it in person to believe it was happening. I got in the elevator, and the last thing I saw through the closing doors was my mother leaning across the table, her wine wine glass frozen halfway to her lips, watching my sister's face change. The messages started before I'd even gotten my key in my apartment door. My father, your mother is crying. My sister, you humiliated me on purpose. I hope you're happy. My mother called 4 times in a row, then sent a voice memo asking me to come back and end the night on a better note, as though the note I'd left it on had been my choice and not the one they'd all handed me across a dinner table in front of 40 relatives. I turned the phone face down on my counter and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months, which surprised me more than any of the messages did. By morning, there were 31 texts in the family group chat, and my sister had posted a long paragraph explaining that emotions had run high, that things had been taken out of context, that she'd only meant it as teasing. Nobody responded for almost an hour. Then my aunt, who had been sitting close enough to hear the coordinator's exact words the night before, wrote a single line. Which part was out of context? The part where you told her she didn't pay, or the bill that said she did? My sister didn't answer that one. My father called a family meeting for that evening at my parents' house, which is not a thing my father does. In 30 years, I had watched him avoid confrontation with the dedication of a man who considered conflict a personal weather event, something to wait out rather than address. I agreed to come on one condition. Nobody would ask me to apologize for leaving. When I arrived, my grandmother was already there, in the armchair by the window, quiet in the particular way she gets when she's decided to watch rather than participate. My sister sat across from me with her arms crossed, and I understood from the set of her jaw that she had spent the day rehearsing a version of the evening where she came out sympathetic. My mother opened with a speech I'd expected, the one about family and misunderstandings and how one difficult night shouldn't erase years of love. I let her finish before I said anything. I signed the contract 2 months ago, I said. I paid the deposit myself in my own name. I approved every line item on that bill except the ones I specifically rejected in writing. None of that is a misunderstanding. It's just something none of you wanted to be true at the table last night until you had no choice. My sister uncrossed her arms. I never said you didn't help, she said, which wasn't what she'd said, and everyone in the room knew it. You told the whole table I didn't pay, I said, in front of people who don't know either of us well enough to ask questions. You knew exactly what that would do. My grandmother spoke then for the first time since I'd arrived, in the mild, unhurried voice she uses for things she's already made her mind up about. I'd like to hear you say it plainly, she said to my sister. Not tease, not context. Did you tell your sister she hadn't paid for something you knew she had? My sister's composure, which had survived my mother's gentler questions without much trouble, didn't survive that one. She looked at our grandmother the way you look at someone you'd hoped wouldn't be paying close attention, and something in her posture folded. Yes, she said quietly, and then, louder, like she needed to get all of it out before she lost the nerve. Yes, okay, I knew. I've been taking credit for things you've done for years, and I don't even fully understand why anymore. It just started, and then it kept working, and every time it worked I did it again, and last night I didn't think. I just wanted people to see me the way they see you when you do something nice. And I panicked when you actually reached for the food because it made it real, and I said the cruelest thing I could think of instead of just letting you eat. It wasn't a perfect apology. There was more self-pity in it than I would have liked, more focus on how it had felt for her than on what it had cost me. But it was more honesty than she had ever offered me in one sitting, and I could see it cost her something to say it in front of our grandmother. My father, without being asked, said my sister would repay the deposit I'd lost and reimburse the portion of the bill our parents had ended up covering after the card declined. My mother, for once, didn't argue on her behalf. My sister nodded, wrote a check on the spot, and slid it across the coffee table without meeting my eyes. I want to say I felt something larger than relief in that moment, something closer to vindication, but mostly I just felt tired and grateful that it was over and ready to go home. My grandmother caught my eye as I stood to leave and gave me a small, private nod, the kind she's been giving me since I was small enough to need it translated. I thought, driving home that night, that the worst of it was finally behind us. I want to be honest about how wrong I was, because it matters later that I believed it completely. For a few weeks, it really did seem over. My sister and I texted a handful of times, careful and a little formal, the way you talk to someone you're not sure you trust yet, but are trying to. My mother stopped bringing up the dinner entirely, which was its own kind of relief. My father sent me a photo of the two of them repainting the back porch, captioned "Nothing to see here," and I laughed out loud in my kitchen, alone, for the first time in what felt like a long time. I told myself the family had course-corrected, in its slow and reluctant way, and that I should let it rest there. Mostly, I did. What I couldn't let rest was the text my grandmother had sent the night of the dinner, the one asking if either of us could help her sort out something with a bank, nothing urgent, and my sister's reply, dashed off between courses, "Don't worry, Grandma, I've got it handled." I hadn't followed up on it. In the version of that week where the dinner consumed all my attention, it had simply fallen off the edge of what I was tracking. I brought coffee on a Sunday the way I always do, and we did the crossword at our kitchen table with the radio playing low in the next room, and about halfway through I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether she'd ever gotten that bank thing sorted out. She looked up at me with an expression I didn't like, somewhere between relief and confusion. "Oh, your sister took care of it," she said. "She's been so good about all that lately." I hardly look at the statements myself anymore, honestly. She said it was easier if she just kept an eye on things so I don't have to squint at that tiny print. What kind of thing was it that you needed sorted out? She waved a hand, the gesture she uses when she's decided something isn't worth the energy of remembering, precisely. Some withdrawal I didn't recognize. I'm sure it was nothing. Your sister explained it. She paused and something crossed her face, quick and gone. I don't remember exactly what she said now that you ask. Isn't that strange? I remember being worried, and then I remember not being feeling worried anymore, but the part in between has gone a bit soft. I have known my grandmother my whole life as a woman with a mind like a filing cabinet. The kind of person who remembers not just your birthday, but the birthday of the friend you mentioned once in passing 3 years ago. Hearing her describe a memory as having gone soft landed somewhere in my chest I didn't have a name for yet. "Can I see the statement?" I asked, keeping my voice light, the tone you use for a favor rather than a request. "I'm curious what these online banking sites look like now. I might set one up for myself." She got her tablet from the side table, the one my sister had apparently set up for her a year or so back, and handed it to me without hesitation, the way she's handed me things her whole life, trusting that I'd give them back the way I found them. I scrolled through the transaction history while she worked on 7 down, and it took me a minute to understand what I was looking at, because at first it looked ordinary. Groceries, the pharmacy, her hairdresser. And then, threaded through the ordinary ones at what felt like uncomfortably regular intervals. Transfers, $200 here, $300 there. Once, in March, $800. Memo line blank. Recipient listed only by initials I recognized immediately as my sister's. I didn't say anything right away. I kept scrolling quietly while my grandmother hummed along to whatever was playing in the other room, and I counted at least 11 transfers going back over the better part of a year. Nothing so large on its own that it would have triggered any alarm, but adding up by my rough mental math to something considerably larger than the extras my sister had once claimed my dinner contributions had covered. "Everything all right, sweetheart?" my grandmother asked without looking up from the crossword. "Fine," I said, and I meant it to sound steadier than it came out. "Just admiring how organized your sister keeps this." She smiled, eased, entirely unaware of what I'd just seen, and went back to her puzzle, and I sat there at her kitchen table with her tablet warm in my hands, doing the math again, more carefully this time, and feeling something cold settle into the base of my spine that had nothing to do with the coffee going cold in front of me. I didn't say anything to my grandmother that day beyond what I'd already said. I finished the crossword with her, washed our mugs, and drove home with my phone in the cup holder, and my mind somewhere else entirely, running the numbers again and again like they might resolve into something more innocent the 5th time through. They didn't. I have spent most of my adult life being the person in this family who documents things quietly without expecting to need the documentation, and that habit is the only reason I didn't do what some other version of me might have done that week, which is drive straight to my sister's apartment and demand an explanation across her kitchen counter. I have watched what happens when I confront her without proof. She reframes, she cries, she finds the one detail I got slightly wrong and uses it to discredit everything I got right. I wasn't going to hand her that opportunity again, not with something this size. Instead, I went back to my grandmother's the following Tuesday, under the same easy pretext of coffee and the crossword, and asked gently if I could look through her filing cabinet for an old recipe she'd once promised to dig out for me. She waved me toward the study without a second thought. It took me 20 minutes to find what I was looking for, tucked behind a folder of expired warranties, a bank form dated 14 months earlier, adding a second name to her primary checking account. Not power of attorney, something quieter and, in its way, more troubling, because it required active cooperation rather than a legal designation imposed during a crisis. A joint account holder has full, unsupervised access to every dollar in that account, with no obligation to explain a single withdrawal to anyone, including the person whose name was there first. My sister's signature was on the second line, dated and neat. My grandmother's was on the first, and it looked, when I held it up next to a birthday card in her own handwriting from around the same period, subtly different, not dramatically. Not the kind of difference you could take to a courtroom on its own, but looser somehow, the letters slightly less connected than her usual hand. The kind of signature you might produce if you were signing something you didn't fully understand you were signing, or signing it for someone standing over your shoulder, telling you where the bank needed your initials. I brought the form out to the kitchen table and asked my grandmother, as evenly as I could manage, if she remembered signing it. She studied it for a long moment, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. "I remember your sister bringing some papers by," she said slowly. "She said the bank needed an update because of some new fraud rules, something about needing a second contact on file in case they couldn't reach me. I don't recall it saying anything about her name going on the account itself. Is that what this says?" It was exactly what it said, in language plain enough that I didn't think my grandmother would have missed it if she'd read it carefully and without someone standing beside her, narrating a friendlier version of the document than the one actually printed on the page. I didn't say that to her directly. I didn't need to. I watched her read it a second time, more slowly, and watched her face do something I had never seen it do before. A kind of quiet, dawning humiliation that had nothing to do with getting older and everything to do with realizing, in real time, that someone she trusted completely had used that trust as a door. "I think I need to talk to someone who understands this better than I do," I told her, which was true, and which was also the gentlest way I could think of to say what I actually meant, which was that I no longer trusted myself to handle this quietly within the family, the way we handle everything, because the last time I'd tried to resolve something with my sister using nothing but the truth and a family meeting, the truth had been treated as a negotiable detail rather than a fact. My grandmother agreed, faster than I expected, and I understood from how quickly she agreed that some part of her had already known, on some level beneath the one she was willing to look at directly, that something here required more than a conversation at her kitchen table. I found an elder law attorney 2 towns over through a coworker whose own mother had gone through something similar a few years back, someone who specialized in exactly this particular, quiet, unglamorous category of harm, the kind that doesn't look like anything until you lay 14 months of it end to end. I made the appointment silent for the following week. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell my father. I certainly didn't tell my sister. I had learned the hard way at that dinner table and at every family occasion before it that the only version of the truth that survives contact with this family intact is the one that arrives with someone else's signature underneath it, someone with no stake in protecting anybody's version of events but the facts themselves. The attorney's office was small, tucked above a dry cleaner's, nothing like the glass and marble firms I'd half expected, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, taking notes in a shorthand I couldn't read upside down. When I finished, she asked to see the joint account form and the transfer history I'd photographed off my grandmother's tablet, and she went quiet for a long moment, scrolling. "This is a pattern I see more often than you think," she said finally. "It rarely looks dramatic from the inside. Nobody breaks in. Nobody threatens anybody. It's usually someone who's already trusted, offering to make something easier, and then quietly expanding what easier means until there's no line left between helping and taking." She looked up at me. 14 months of transfers at this frequency, plus a joint account added under circumstances your grandmother doesn't fully remember agreeing to. That's not a family disagreement. Depending on what we find when we pull the full history, that could be financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, which in this state is a reportable offense, not just a civil matter between the two of them. She explained the process in plain terms. A formal request to the bank for a complete transaction history going back further than my grandmother's app displayed by default. A referral to a forensic accountant she worked with regularly, someone who could trace the transfers properly and produce a report that would hold up if this ever went further than a family conversation. Depending on what that report showed, a report to the state's Adult Protective Services Division, which existed for precisely this kind of situation and had authority my family on its own, simply didn't. "I want to be careful about something," I told her. "I don't want this handled the way things usually get handled in my family, where the loudest apology wins and nothing changes underneath it. I want to know, actually know, what happened before anyone gets a chance to explain it away." She nodded like she'd heard some version of that sentence from 100 other people sitting in the chair I was sitting in. "That's exactly why we go through the bank and the accountant first," she said. "Documents don't apologize. They just say what they say." It took 3 weeks. I went to work and had dinner with my parents twice, carefully, and said nothing. I visited my grandmother on Sundays. Coffee and the crossword, same as always, and said nothing there either, though it cost me more than I expected to sit across from her without telling her exactly what was in motion. My sister texted twice during that stretch, once about a cousin's baby shower, once, out of nowhere, to ask if I'd talked to Grandma lately. "She seems a little different, don't you think?" I stared at that message for a long time before I answered, careful not to say anything her instincts could read as suspicion. "Just old age," I typed back. "She's fine." I have no idea to this day whether she was actually worried about our grandmother or whether some part of her had felt me getting closer and was testing the water to see how much I knew. The forensic accountant's report came back on a Thursday afternoon, 26 pages, and the attorney called me before I'd finished the first 3 to say, in the careful, neutral voice of someone who has learned not to editorialize ahead of the client, that the number was larger than either of us had estimated from the tablet alone because the bank's older records showed transfers going back closer to 20 months rather than 14, several of them larger than anything visible in the recent history, and a pattern immediately following each transfer of my grandmother's balance being quietly topped back up to look ordinary before her monthly paper statement arrived, using money moved from an account in my sister's name and then moved out again days later, in amounts calibrated, it seemed, to stay just below whatever threshold might have triggered a call from the bank. She was covering her tracks, I said out loud, to no one, sitting alone in my kitchen with the report open on my laptop. "I'd want you to hear the exact figure from us directly, in person, along with your grandmother, before anyone else in the family hears it from anyone at all," the attorney said. "Given what we're seeing, I also think it's time we looped in the state's Elder Protection Division formally, which means this stops being something your family gets to manage quietly, one way or another. I know that isn't a small thing to hear. I think it's the right thing regardless." I asked her to set the meeting for the following week at my grandmother's kitchen table, the same table where I'd first opened that tablet and started counting. I told my parents and my sister only that we needed to go over something with my grandmother's finances together at her house on Sunday. I didn't say more than that, not because I wanted to ambush anyone, but because I had learned months earlier that the only version of this that would survive the room intact was the one nobody had a chance to rehearse a response to in advance. My grandmother sat at the head of her own kitchen table, upright in a way that made clear she had decided deliberately not to let this happen to her from a chair in the corner. The attorney sat to her right, the forensic accountant, a quiet, precise woman with a folder thick enough that my sister eyed it twice before anyone had said a word, sat beside her. My parents took the 2 remaining chairs. My sister stood behind one of them, arms crossed, the same posture she'd worn the night my father called the family meeting about the dinner, though this time there was something uncertain underneath it, like she already sensed the shape of the room before anyone had explained it to her. The accountant didn't waste time on preamble. She opened the folder, laid a single summary page in the center of the table where everyone could see it, and said in a flat, careful voice built for exactly this kind of sentence that a full forensic review of the joint account had identified 61 unauthorized transfers over 20 months, totaling just under $41,000, with a consistent pattern of the account balance being replenished from a separate source within days of each withdrawal, time to land before the next paper statement, in amounts structured specifically to avoid the bank's automatic fraud review. you. That's not forgetfulness, the accountant said. That's concealment. Someone here knew exactly what the statement threshold was and adjusted the amounts to stay under it consistently for almost 2 years. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father sat completely still, the way he does when he's absorbing something too large to react to properly on the first pass. My sister's arms uncrossed slowly, and I watched every trace of the posture she'd walked in with drain out of her all at once, replaced by nothing. No story, no reframe, no detail to seize on and use to discredit the rest, because there was no rest to discredit. There was only a number and a pattern and her name on the second line of an account she had never had permission to use as her own. "Grandma, I can explain," she started, but our grandmother lifted one hand, the same small, unhurried gesture she'd used on my sister the night of the dinner, and the sentence died before it finished forming. "I would like to hear the explanation," my grandmother said, "but not before I hear whether you understand what you did." Her voice didn't shake. I don't think I had ever loved her more than I did in that exact second, watching her refuse, at 83, at her own kitchen table, to let anyone soften the shape of what had happened to her before she'd even been allowed to name it herself. My sister opened her mouth like she had an answer ready, the kind she always has ready, the kind that has gotten her out of every room she's ever needed out of. And then, for the first time in my life, I watched her visibly not have one. "I meant to put it back," she said finally, quietly, to the tablecloth rather than to our grandmother. "I always meant to put it all back before anyone noticed." Our grandmother studied her for a long moment, the kind of look she usually reserves for a crossword clue she suspects has a trick in it. "You didn't put it back," she said. "You put back just enough, just often enough to keep me from noticing. Those aren't the same thing, and I think you understood the difference perfectly well, or you wouldn't have been so careful about the timing of it." Nobody at the table moved to fill the silence that followed. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my sister didn't try to fill it either. The attorney spoke next, and her voice carried the particular gravity of someone who has said this sentence before and knows exactly how much weight it needs to land correctly. "Given the amount, the duration, and the documented concealment," she explained, "this had already crossed the threshold into what the state defined as financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and she had a legal and, in this case, a personal obligation to formally notify the state's Adult Protective Services Division, effective immediately, along with a referral for possible criminal charges depending on how the agency's own investigation proceeded." This was no longer a conversation the family got to have privately and resolve with a check across a coffee table. It belonged now to people with no stake in anyone's version of events but the truth of the documents in front of them. "Effective today, the joint account will be frozen pending the investigation," the attorney continued, "and going forward, any contact regarding the case will run through the agency directly, not through this family. I know that changes the shape of the next several weeks for everyone at this table, not just for the two of you." She said it evenly, without looking specifically at my sister when she said it, which somehow made it land harder than if she had. My sister's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. She looked at our mother, waiting, I think, for the old reflex, the smile that ends conflicts before they finish starting. The real family comes first that had rescued her at every dinner table for as long as I could remember. My mother didn't look back at her. She was staring at the summary page in the center of the table, at the number, at the 20 months, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched her run out of a version of this story that let my sister remain the daughter she had always chosen to see.